Here is the true-life story of Chris Kyle, presented in 4 individual parts as you requested. It is written in a simple, engaging, third-person style to ensure the audience remains captivated throughout. The Texas sun was beginning its slow descent over the rugged landscape, casting long shadows across the dusty field. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, stood with his father, his small hands wrapped around the stock of a bolt-action point 30-06 Springfield rifle. It was heavy, almost too heavy for him to hold steady, but the man behind him, a deacon at the local church, and a man who believed in self-reliance, provided the support. This was a rite of passage in the Kyle household, a lesson not just in marksmanship, but in patience, discipline, and respect for the power a firearm held. The boy's name was Chris Kyle, and on that day, no one could have predicted that this simple act of hunting deer and quail in the Texas hill country was the first step on a path that would lead him to become a ghost, a legend, and eventually a martyr to the brotherhood he served. Growing up in Odessa, Chris and his younger brother Jeff were raised in a world that valued grit and hard work. The Kyle family ran a small cattle ranch, and the boys were expected to pull their weight, tending to the herd and mending fences. It was a classic American upbringing, steeped in the traditions of the West. Chris was a typical boy, rowdy and competitive, but he was also quiet and observant, a trait that would later serve him well. He played baseball and football, but his first true love was rodeo. After graduating high school in Midlothian, he set his sights on becoming a professional bronco rider, attending Tarleton State University to study ranch management while chasing the rodeo circuit. He was good, too, with a natural seat and the fearlessness required to stay on a bucking animal twice his size. But the rodeo is a cruel sport, and in one violent second, a horse landed on him during a competition. The result was a shattered arm, held together by metal pins, and a shattered dream. The injury was severe, breaking ribs, damaging a kidney and a lung, and forcing him to accept that his career as a cowboy was over. For a young man who defined himself by his physical toughness, it was a devastating blow. He needed a new direction, a new purpose. That purpose would find its voice in the aftermath of another life-changing event. On a whim, he walked into a recruiting office. And he was initially looking for the Army, but the office was empty. A Navy recruiter, seeing a capable young man, seized the opportunity and began to paint a picture of the ultimate challenge, the SEALs. The idea of being part of an elite brotherhood, of testing himself against the hardest training the military had to offer, ignited a fire in Chris. He enlisted in 1999, but the ghost of his rodeo accident immediately came back to haunt him. The metal pins in his arm were a glaring red flag, and he was initially rejected for basic underwater demolition/SEAL, BUD/S training. But Chris Kyle was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He persisted, he trained, and he proved that the arm was strong. Eventually, the Navy relented, and he found himself on the beaches of Coronado, California, facing the most notorious induction process in the world. And the instructors, with their distinctive brown shirts, seemed to take joy in pushing the men past their breaking point. The cold Pacific surf, the sand, the logs, the constant physical and mental harassment. It was a crucible designed to melt away the weak. Chris, the quiet Texan, with something to prove, not only survived but thrived, finding a home among a class of hardened warriors. He graduated with BUD/S Class 233 in March 2001, just months before the world would change forever. He had finally found his herd, his brotherhood. He was a Navy SEAL. The quiet Texan had been forged into a weapon, and the country was about to go to war. Assigned to SEAL Team 3, Platoon Charlie, also known as Cadillac, Kyle was thrust into the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It was there, in the dusty, chaotic streets of Nasiriyah, yet that the hunter became a killer. He was positioned on a rooftop, providing overwatch for a column of Marines, when he saw her, a woman walking towards the troops, a child cradled in one arm and a grenade clutched in the other. Through the scope of his .300 Winchester Magnum, the world narrowed to a single horrifying focal point. He yelled a warning to the Marines below, but they couldn't hear him. The woman kept walking. The rules of engagement were clear, but the situation was anything but. He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had never killed anyone before. He had never killed a woman. The SEAL next to him, his platoon chief, saw the hesitation and barked the order. "Shoot!" Chris Kyle squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle broke the silence, and the woman crumpled to the ground. And the grenade exploded a second later, harmless. He had saved the lives of several Marines, but he had also ended one. It was his duty, he would later say, and he didn't regret it. But that moment marked him. It was the first note in a symphony of violence that would define his life for the next 6 years. He had crossed a line, and as he would later bluntly state, after the first kill, the others come easy. The statement wasn't one of glee, but of a chilling reality he had to accept to survive and do his job. The streets of Ramadi in 2006 were a sniper's paradise and an infantryman's nightmare. It was here that the legend of Chris Kyle was truly cemented, earning him the nicknames that would follow him for the rest of his life. The legend, from his brothers, and Al-Shaitan ar-Ramadi, the devil of Ramadi, from the insurgency. And to the enemy he was a ghost, a one-man death squad whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and fury. They placed a bounty on his head starting at $20,000 and eventually ballooning to $80,000, a testament to the toll he was taking on their ranks. He was a primary target, and every insurgent with a rusty AK-47 dreamed of being the one to take out the tall, dark-haired American with the Crusader cross tattooed on his arm. But for Kyle, the tattoo was a symbol of his mission, to protect the innocent, the men he called his boys, the Marines and soldiers he watched over from his perches high above the carnage. Life as a sniper was a strange contradiction of intense action and interminable boredom. He would spend hours, sometimes days, lying motionless on a rooftop or in an abandoned building, baked by the sun or shivering in the cold, his eye pressed against the scope of his rifle. He was a watcher, a guardian angel perched on the edge of hell. He learned to read the city, to recognize patterns, to spot the anomaly that signaled danger. He watched children play, women hang laundry, and men go about their business, all while waiting for the one who would pick up a weapon. The waiting was the hardest part, a test of mental fortitude that was as grueling as any physical challenge from BUD/S. But when the waiting stopped, the action was violent and final. One afternoon, while watching a street from a rooftop, he spotted a moped speeding through the city. On the back was a man who dropped a backpack into a pothole. Kyle's instincts screamed IED. Without hesitation, he tracked the moped, calculated the lead, and squeezed the trigger from 150 yards. The single round tore through the first insurgent, striking him in the spine, and continued on to hit the driver, killing them both. It was a shot of incredible skill and deadly efficiency, a perfect example of what he called getting good bang for the buck for the American taxpayer. In the brutal house-to-house fighting of Fallujah, his dark humor sometimes surfaced as a coping mechanism. He once watched a group of 16 insurgents trying to cross a river using 4 beach balls as flotation devices. Instead of shooting the men, he shot the balls. One by one, he popped them, watching as the men struggled, fought, and ultimately drowned. Hell, it was a lot of fun, he later recalled, a grim reflection of the dehumanization required to survive such a conflict. To him, and they weren't men in those moments. They were targets, enemy combatants trying to kill his friends. Despite the toll it took on him, Kyle was fiercely proud of his work. He saw his role not as a killer, but as a protector. The official Pentagon count would eventually confirm 160 kills, making him the deadliest sniper in American military history, surpassing the previous record of 109 set by the legendary Carlos Hathcock. Kyle himself claimed the number was higher, closer to 255, but the fog of war makes every kill difficult to verify. He was awarded 2 Silver Stars and 5 Bronze Stars for valor, a testament to his courage under fire. But the most important validation came from the grunts on the ground. He remembers walking through a contested neighborhood after a long day of overwatch, and a young Marine stopped him. The Marine said, "Hey, thanks for watching out for us. We heard you were the one up there." It was moments like that, the simple gratitude in the eyes of a scared kid far from home, that made the horror of his job worthwhile. He was their guardian, their protector, the cold, unblinking eye in the sky that kept them alive for one more day. However, the physical and mental cost was mounting. By his 4th tour in 2008, Chris Kyle was a collection of scars and suppressed trauma. He had been shot twice. He had survived 6 IED explosions, the concussive blasts leaving him with permanent headaches and a ringing in his ears that would never stop. The body armor and a lucky ricochet off his helmet were all that stood between him and death. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the ghosts accumulating in his mind. And the face of the woman with the grenade, the men drowning in the river, the countless bodies he had seen crumple through his scope, they were all there, waiting in the quiet moments. Back home, his wife, Taya, was raising their 2 young children, struggling to connect with a man who seemed increasingly distant and haunted. Their marriage was fraying, stretched thin by long deployments and the wall Chris had built around himself to survive. He realized he had to make a choice: the Navy or his family. In 2009, with deep reluctance but a clear mind, he took off his uniform for the last time. The legend was coming home. Coming home from war is never a simple journey. For Chris Kyle, the transition from the battlefields of Iraq to the quiet suburbs of Midlothian, Texas, was a disorienting and difficult process. And the man who could remain motionless for hours while scanning for enemies now found it hard to sit still in his own living room. The hypervigilance that kept him alive in Ramadi made him jump at loud noises and constantly scan restaurants for exits. He was a warrior without a war, a man struggling to find his place in a world that seemed mundane and, at times, meaningless. He threw himself into new projects, trying to recapture the sense of purpose he felt as a SEAL. He founded Craft International, a tactical training company dedicated to teaching military, law enforcement, and civilian clients the skills of combat marksmanship. The company's motto, "Despite what your mama told you, violence does solve problems, Maidi," was pure Kyle, blunt, provocative, and born from a lifetime of experience. He also began to write. With the help of co-authors Scott McEwen and Jim DeFelice, he poured his story onto the pages of a book called American Sniper. It was a raw, unflinching account of his life, from his Texas childhood to his most harrowing combat experiences. He wrote about the pride he felt in his service and the grim satisfaction of a well-placed shot. He didn't shy away from the controversy, including a chapter titled Punching Out Scruffface, in which he described an altercation at a bar in Coronado following the funeral of his friend and fellow SEAL, Michael Mansour. In the book, he claimed to have punched a man who was disrespecting the fallen and the military. He later identified the man as Jesse Ventura, the former governor of Minnesota. This admission would eventually lead to a defamation lawsuit that would cast a shadow over his post-war life. And with Ventura denying the incident ever happened, despite the brewing legal storm, the book was an instant phenomenon. Released in 2012, American Sniper shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, where it would stay for 37 weeks. Chris Kyle, the quiet professional who operated in the shadows, was suddenly a celebrity. He was invited onto national television shows like Conan O'Brien and appeared in a reality TV series called Stars Earn Stripes, where he trained actor Dean Cain. The American public was fascinated by this tall, soft-spoken Texan who spoke so plainly about killing. He didn't fit the stereotype of a troubled, brooding veteran. In public, he was charming, funny, and seemed well-adjusted. But the adjustment was a performance. He was still searching for peace. And he found it in a familiar place, service to his brothers. The war was over for him, but for thousands of other veterans, the battle was just beginning. They were coming home with missing limbs, shattered minds, and the invisible wounds of post-traumatic stress disorder. Kyle saw himself in them and felt a profound responsibility to help. He worked extensively with the Fitco Cares Foundation, particularly with their Heroes Project, which provided free fitness equipment, personal training, and life coaching to disabled veterans and those suffering from PTSD. He believed that physical activity and the camaraderie of other vets could be a powerful antidote to the darkness. He would spend hours on the phone with struggling veterans, listening to their problems, sharing his own struggles, and offering the kind of tough love that only a fellow warrior could provide. He would drive for hours to visit them in the hospital or take them out for a beer. He wasn't a trained therapist. He was a friend, a brother who understood the language of trauma without it needing to be spoken. It was this mission of mercy, this desire to heal the broken, that would ultimately lead him to his fate. On a cold Saturday morning, February 2nd, 2013, Chris Kyle's phone rang. It was his friend, Chad Littlefield, a fellow veteran and neighbor. Chad had been contacted by the mother of a young man, a former Marine named Eddie Ray Ruth. Routh was in a bad way, suffering from severe PTSD and paranoia. He had been hospitalized in a mental institution and was spiraling out of control. His mother was desperate, and she knew Chris Kyle was a famous veteran who helped people, and she begged him to talk to her son, to take him shooting, to do something to pull him back from the edge. Chris didn't hesitate. This was his calling. He agreed to meet Chad and Eddie at Rough Creek Lodge, a resort and shooting range about 50 miles southwest of Fort Worth. The plan was simple: spend the day shooting, bond over their shared military experience, and try to give this lost soul a lifeline. As Chris's big black Ford F350 truck pulled into the range, he had no idea he was driving towards his own death. He was simply doing what he always did, putting himself in harm's way for the sake of another. He was still the protector, the guardian. But this time, the battlefield was a quiet patch of Texas scrubland. And the enemy was the invisible trauma in a young man's mind. He was about to learn that some wounds are too deep to heal, and some demons cannot be exorcised with a round of target practice. The day was sunny and clear, a perfect day for shooting. Chris, Chad, and Eddie walked out onto the range, the air filled with the pop of gunfire from other shooters. Chris and Chad, ever the instructors, set up targets and began to guide Eddie. For a while, everything seemed normal, but Chris, the sniper, was trained to read people. He noticed something was off. Eddie was quiet, jittery, and his eyes held a vacant, unsettling stare. At one point, Chris turned to Chad and muttered a warning that would prove terrifyingly prophetic. "This dude is straight up nuts." Minutes later, the shooting started. But this time, the targets weren't paper. Eddie Ray Routh turned his gun on the two men who had come to save him, firing round after round into their backs. Chris Kyle, the man who had survived an $80,000 bounty and the worst hell Iraq could offer, fell to the ground, killed by a fellow American he was trying to help. The news of Chris Kyle's death sent shock